Welcome to the last part of our metaphysics section and this discussion on personal identity. Moving on from the view of animalism, we finally arrive at the brain view, which maybe it's what you've been waiting for in asking the question or attempting to answer the question, what am I? Maybe if you're, not convinced that you're a soul or that you're some sort of psychologically continuous entity, or just a psychological continuity, or that you're an animal, biological human animal, then maybe, just maybe, you could say, well, why not just say that I'm a brain? I'm a brain. I'm not my body. I'm not this animal here. I am a part of this animal. I am the thinking part of this animal. Now, the brain view itself has a bunch of initial pros. Uh, that is, so like, it seems to get a bunch of our intuitions correct. So, a bunch of our intuitions about specific kinds of cases, it seems to get right, right? So, it gets our intuitions right on the brain swap cases, right? It seems like if it's possible at some point in the future to swap someone's brain or head from one body to another, it seems like, the animal stays put, the animal stays with the body. So if you just take, if you swap one part from one animal into another, the you don't have a different animal, but so the animal stays put. But it seems, at least we would think, that if you could swap the brain, that the person would somehow go with the brain, right? If you could swap somebody's brain from one body to another and it would work, then you would think, at the very least intuitively, this is just your intuitions, that the memories and psychological traits and who the person is, the identity of the person would switch with the brain. A sort of, little con here, we don't get the psychology swap, like the Freaky Friday scenarios, right? But once again, like, it's like which we can imagine by like magic or God, the possibility of swapping souls, or swapping psychologies onto different brains, like mapping, like, uploading and downloading a psychology from one body to another. But that, again, given the previous argument for when we're talking about animalism, maybe that's just not actually possible. It might be something that we can imagine, but just because we can imagine it doesn't make it genuinely possible. Another pro of the brain view is that it allows us, in a sense, to be replaced bit by bit. So this is a Borg creature on the right, from anyone that's watched Star Trek before. You can imagine a situation in, like, say way in the future, where we've been, most of our body has been replaced by mechanical parts. It seems like, in a way, like you could basically cut off each part of your body and replacing it with some kind of mechanical or cybernetic part, cyborg part. Um, More and more, right? You could get a cyborg arm, a cyborg heart, a cyborg eyes. We could slowly replace each and every part of our body, but it doesn't seem like you could replace the brain, at least intuitively, right? It's like maybe you could replace a small part of the brain, but you couldn't replace the whole brain. It seems like the brain is where you are, and if you somehow, if you slowly changed all of your parts to cybernetic, cyborg parts, but then you came to the brain and changed that, well, that would kill you, right? That then it wouldn't be you anymore; it'd be something else. That seems, at least somewhat plausible and intuitive, that as long as everything gets replaced except the brain, it's still you. It's unclear if the animal could possibly survive in that context, right? I mean, like, imagine you've got the animal that you are, but slowly, because some horrific accident occurs, and we have to replace all of your internal organs, and then eventually, your skin fails, or something, so we have to replace your skin with some non organic stuff, and we have to replace your blood with some non-organic stuff. We have to replace like uh, everything about you except your brain, even your bones. You know, you get bone cancer. We got to take them out, and we're gonna put some adamantium metal in for your bones. Uh, Looks like at that point, you know, you're a completely cyborg thing, but as long as your brain is still intact, it seems like you might still be there. Some more pros of the view. It sort of gets the fetus issue right, right? So the animalism says one of the pros of animalism is that it gets this it gets to say, look, this animal was once a fetus. I was once a fetus. Great, you know, the psychology view can't say that. The soul view kind of doesn't really get to say that, right? But yeah, so the animal view does kind of say that, and that seems like an interesting pro in the animal view. But for you know, for the brain view, it kind of gets to say it as well, not strictly speaking, but you know, that there was once an animal. This animal here was once a fetus, and I was that fetus's underdeveloped brain. And when I came into existence, wasn't, you know, the moment of conception, but it was the moment that the fetus started to develop a brain, which is, you know, early on in gestation. And that seems like an interesting time also to like argue that, you know, I've come into existence. I came into existence the moment that the fetus started being able to think or you know, have pre-thoughts in whatever way that would be, right? As soon as the brain started developing, and the precursors to the development of real genuine adult thinking got underway. Maybe that's right when you know, the spark of my existence started. Another pro is that the brain view seems to get the vegetable problem right, right? So imagine somebody's totally brain dead, you know, they're in a horrible accident, and they end up, you know, we've got this body that's hooked up to machines in the hospital that's keeping it alive. It seems like there's still an animal that's breathing, that's there, right? There's still an animal there that's alive, but is the person there? It doesn't seem like it, right? Like it seems like the person is dead, the person is gone, the person can't come back. So it seems at least sort of right here, like that, you know, this gives us an explanation. The reason that the person's gone is because the person is the brain, and the brain is dead. If you're brain dead, and if you are a brain, and when you go brain dead, then, you know, your body can continue on, but you're gone. You're toast. That's how you die, is brain death. And that seems like a somewhat plausible thing, right? Like this seems to get this right, where the animalist view, seems to get things kind of intuitively wrong, I would think. So why hold the brain view? Well, it seems kind of plausible. It's on the surface a plausible idea that, you know, I am a brain. I'm a thinking thing. My brain is the thing that thinks, and so I'm a brain. It seems like it solves the too many thinkers objection, right? For the one against animalism. It's, yeah, I'm not, you know, what am I? Well, I'm the brain that's right here, that's thinking, right? It's doing the thinking. There's nothing bigger or smaller than the brain that's doing the thinking. You know, so I am a brain. Brains are the center of your consciousness and thought. So it seems like if anything other than the brain, like a person or animal, if anything else, sort of, if anything that we normally say is thinking is also thinking, then we can say that those things are thinking because they have a brain that is doing the thinking, right? In the same way that, like, so I can kick a ball, but I don't think of myself as a leg, right? The leg is the thing that's doing the kicking the ball, but I'm not a leg. I can use my leg to kick the ball, right? So, you know, it's the same sort of thing, right? This animal can think, but the reason that this animal can think is because it can use its brain. And using its brain is the thing that's thinking. And so, you know, it's okay to say that an animal thinks, but only in this way, and in that the animal thinks using a part of itself, right? Now, on to some cons and then arguments against the brain view. So first, there's a few cons against the brain view, and this sort of, I don't know. The brain view has some initially unintuitive results that you might not have thought about. So on the brain view, it turns out that you are very different from a lot of the normal ways that you describe yourself, right? So suppose you're 5'7" and you weigh 140 pounds. Well, actually, you don't, right? You are not 5'7" and you do not weigh 140 pounds. Instead, you are, 4 to 6 inches tall and weigh approximately 3 to 4 pounds and are mostly composed of gray matter. You do not have arms and legs. You are part of a body that has arms and legs, right? You are not currently sitting. You are not currently looking at a computer screen. You are inside of a body that is sitting. You are inside of a body whose eyes are looking at a computer screen. Um, you have never seen yourself. Wild, right? Unless you've somehow um you had if you had like open head surgery and they videoed it for you, right? You've never seen yourself. You've also never seen anyone else, right? Because all you've seen are their bodies, and what those people are is actually a brain. I mean, maybe you've seen some people's brains, but you probably have never seen anybody's brain while they were alive, so you never saw them while they were alive. So what gives, right? Similarly, like you're not the person that just burned your finger on the stove. You aren't a thing that has fingers as parts, right? You're connected to a body that has fingers as parts. And so all of these kinds of things, these unintuitive results, like you end up being committed to these if you buy the brain view. You have to say, it turns out that you just aren't a lot of the things that you think that you normally are. So we get this sort of simple argument against the brain view that can be augmented in different ways. You can put yourself in here, right? So like this is for me. I am 6 feet tall. My brain is not 6 feet tall. It's 6 inches tall. And then we've got Leibniz's law. If X and Y are identical, then if X has a property, then Y also has that property. Turns out that, my brain and I do not have the property of being the same height. Therefore, I am not identical with my brain. And that seems pretty plausible. If I believe, it turns out if it is me that is 6 feet tall, right? Now, how could you reject this kind of argument? Well, first of all, you don't want to reject premise two, right? My brain is not 6 feet tall; it's 6 inches tall, right? That would be pretty funny. You'd have to have a really tall brain to reject premise two. So you have to reject premise one here, right? You have to say, well, okay, look, I'm not 6 feet tall. I'm actually 6 inches tall. But that's okay. If you're a brain theorist, you really have to do some jumping jacks. So you have to come up with a strategy. You have to come up with a strategy, and you have to say, like, look. There's different ways of speaking. There's a way of speaking loosely and a way of speaking strictly. And most of the time, we aren't speaking strictly when we're talking about ourselves. When we're talking about ourselves, most of the time, we're just talking about, our bodies and what we're doing and how we're living our lives. Most of the time, we're talking about, the animal that's here, that's functioning. It's all the stuff that's connected to me, my brain. But when I'm speaking strictly, that's when I'm talking about me specifically, right? So when I say I'm 6 feet tall, when I say I burnt my finger, when I say that I'm sitting down, I don't mean to literally be saying any of those things, because I am not able to do any of those things. I am not my body. I am not this animal. I'm just speaking loosely, and all of us are speaking loosely most of the time. However, when we're speaking strictly, I can say things like, I'm 6 inches tall, I'm mostly made of gray matter, I weigh, 3.5 pounds, etc. And those things, I can actually say truthfully. It's like a different way of thinking about things, but it's how things really are. So, maybe the brain view does have, some ways around this kind of simple argument. But there's another problem with the brain view, and this sort of brings up the most interesting argument against the brain view. The most interesting argument against the brain view starts with this. So, the main intuition that probably pushed you towards the brain view, anyone that thinks the brain view is correct, is the thought that the brain is ultimately the organ that does all the thinking, right? It's the thing that does all the thinking. It's the smallest part that does all the thinking. If we're interested in what the thinking thing is, right, because of the too many thinkers argument, if we're interested in what the thinking thing is, well, we can get, we've got the animal now, we get smaller and smaller until we get to the brain. And the brain seems like the thinking thing. However, does the whole brain do the thinking? What about your blood vessels in your brain? What about, the cell walls of the neurons? Do those things do the thinking? What parts of your brain, like what in your brain is doing the thinking? And here we get this view called thinking subject minimalism, right? This is the idea that ultimately what I am is the minimal thing that is involved in thinking. The thing that is, I'm in some sense like a purely thinking thing, and what I am is the smallest thing that is that is consistently or contiguously part of thinking. Like it's the smallest thing that is like all of its parts are involved in thinking. So we get this thinking subject minimalism. The minimal thing that is involved in thinking is what I am. And then if we accept that, like that's supposed to be the kind of, you know, intuition that's driving us towards accepting the brain view in the first place. But that intuition can be driven further. And in fact, if we buy that intuition, it seems like we have to reject the brain view itself, because large parts of my brain aren't involved in thinking at all, right? The blood vessels in my brain, most of the gray matter in my brain, these things have very little to do with thinking. In fact, like all of the interesting stuff that's going on in my brain takes place on the surface of my brain, where all of the neurons are interconnected. I don't know if you knew that, but yeah, most of the interesting stuff that's going on in your brain is not happening inside of your brain. It's happening on the outside of your brain. It's happening like on the surface of the brain. So, what gives then? Is it that I'm just some kind of part of a brain? Is that really what I'm going to end up being committed to? That I'm not a brain in the end. I'm just a part of a brain. I'm just like the surface of a brain. Well, we get this thinking part argument out of this kind of way of thinking. So here's the thinking part argument. Premise one, I am a purely thinking thing. Premise two, if something X is a purely thinking thing, then all of X's parts are directly involved in thinking. Premise three, most of my brain is not directly involved in thinking. Four, my brain is not a purely thinking thing. And so, final conclusion, I am not identical with my brain. Premise one seems to be like the subject, thinking subject minimalism, right? It's the idea that I'm, the purely thinking thing. I'm the thing that's the smallest thing that is doing all the thinking. Premise two seems pretty plausible. It's the idea that in order to be a purely thinking thing, all of your parts, if you have parts as a brain surface, have got to be directly involved in the thinking. Otherwise, they're just not part of what it is to be you. And so then in the end, most of your brain is not directly involved in thinking. Your brain, there's lots of big parts of your brain that aren't involved in what's going on when you're thinking. That's premise three. So can the brain view escape this kind of argument? Maybe, right? So 1 through 3 are all premises that are available to be denied. 4 and 5, 4 is a sub-conclusion and 5 is the final conclusion. So what can we deny? So can we deny premise 1? Well, to deny premise 1 would be to accept that you're not a purely thinking thing. And if you accept that you're not a purely thinking thing, then there might be good reason for thinking this, but if you accept that you're not a purely thinking thing, then there's this issue of why think that you're a brain instead of an animal, right? The animal is not a purely thinking thing. So how is it like, why would you go from the animal down to the brain and then down to the part of the brain and realize, no, okay, like I can't go that far, and move from that, move back up to the whole brain, accepting that, whole parts of the brain aren't part of thinking. Like it's like, why go at that size rather than the entire animal, right? Seems like there's lots of parts of the animal that are involved in perception. There's lots of parts of the animal that are involved in like the normal ways in which we think of, things being involved in the underlying necessary things that have to be there for thinking to occur. So if you're going to deny that you're a purely thinking thing, why accept that you're a brain rather than an animal? The line seems to be rather arbitrary. One reason maybe in the end why you would accept this though is that, well, the brain view still solves some of the other problems. It gets some of our other intuitions right, like our intuitions about brain swap cases and our intuitions about the vegetable people that, are brain dead and whether or not they're actually there or not. So, maybe you can deny one and say, look, I'm not a purely thinking thing. But I still think that the brain view is the best view because it gets these other cases right. What about denying premise two? Could we deny premise two and say that being a purely thinking thing shouldn't be seen as requiring that all of one's parts are involved in thinking? Well, maybe, right? So maybe you could say that some parts of your, like your brain, they don't get involved in thinking, but they are necessary for thinking in order to happen, for thinking to happen in the first place. They're necessary parts for thinking to be going on. So maybe, we need blood cells for oxygen and to remove waste from our brain cells. So they aren't involved in thinking, but they are essential for thinking. They're essential for thinking to happen in the first place. It's essential for thinking to happen at all. And if in that case, then we could deny premise two, right? We would hold the first part here fixed and say that this is true. So if X is a purely thinking thing, so I am a purely thinking thing, but then deny that to be a purely thinking thing, all of X's parts are directly involved in thinking, right? So say, okay, I am a purely thinking thing, but it's not the case that all of my parts are involved in thinking. That's something that we could do, but then we'd have to make this argument and say, well, no, okay, so I just don't need all of my parts to be involved in thinking, but I need some of these parts to, get to the point at which I could be thinking. Then there's an issue though, right? So here's an issue with denying premise two. Um, so all those parts that aren't involved in thinking, like your blood cells, well, couldn't we just replace those at some point in the future with like nanobots that do the same function? So like, blood cells, they move stuff around in your body. Um, well, imagine, we got rid of all your blood cells, right? And we replaced them with nanobots that did all of the exact same things. They functioned just like blood cells. They just weren't blood cells, they were nanobots. Well, it would seem like, those nanobots are not part of your body. We just, we pulled the blood cells out of your body and put the nanobots in your body, but they're not part of your body. They didn't come from your body. So they're just in there now. Well, now it seems like, we could maybe do that with all sorts of other stuff. And if those things, if all that stuff can be replaced with, cybernetic machinery, future machinery, then it really seems, weird to deny premise two, right? It just seems like, how we're getting rid of lots of parts of your brain, but still somehow you are you and you are the thing that is doing the thinking because all of those parts just ultimately are unnecessary for doing the thinking in the first place. What about premise three? Could we deny premise three? So premise three again says most of my brain is not directly involved in thinking. That would be similar to denying premise two, but in a different way, right? So what is it to deny premise three? If you denied premise three, you'd have to suggest that instead, all of my parts are involved in thinking, right? All my parts are involved in thinking. It's just not obvious how they're involved and how directly they are involved, right? So it's like the blood cells in my brain are necessary for thinking to occur, given like earlier reasons, like, they move around oxygen and they take away waste. And so are so they're tangentially involved in thinking. Maybe they're not directly involved, like in this like overt, like intense sense of direct, but they are involved, right? And being involved is enough. So that would be a way of denying premise three. And you could say, like, look, no, they are like everything, all of my brain is involved in thinking. It's all involved in some way. And the word directly there is, more or less just a fudge word to say, like, look, some things are less involved than others, but they're still involved. Now, here again, we get the same problem with denying two. Like, all of that stuff seems like maybe in the future there's a possibility of replacing it with cybernetic or little nanobot robot type stuff, and it seems like you'd still be able to think. So if all that stuff is really involved, then what's the deal? Why can we replace it? And then the other issue too is like, well, that's on the small scale. The larger scale, it seems like the whole animal body is a great candidate for a similar argument, right? It seems like your whole animal body is the kind of thing that we could say is involved in thinking, right? Your big toe might not seem like it's involved in thinking, but it's definitely involved in like some of your perceptual capacities, right? If you stub your big toe, you feel it. And that is caused by the nerves that are in your big toe alerting your brain, right? So part of thinking, similarly, like when you want to, you can wiggle your big toe. That is like, thinking in action right there. Thinking reaches down all the way through your body and allows you to move your body, and your body is constantly sending information back up to your brain. And so, maybe all of that stuff that sort of spread out throughout your whole body is part of what it is to think, at least part of what it is to perceive. And assuming that perception is a kind of thinking. So denying premise three seems to come with some problems as well. All right, so in summary, we now have gone through 4 different views on personal identity and 4 different arguments against each view. We talked about the soul view, the Cartesian soul or mind view, and we talked about the causal interaction argument against that view. Then we talked about the psychological continuity view, and then we talked about fission cases and the fission argument against that view. Recently, we talked about animalism, and then we talked about the too many thinkers argument against animalism. And then just now we talked about the brain view, and we gave the thinking part argument against the brain view. So now what I want you to do is to pick one of these 4 views and the arguments that goes along with it. And your final writing assignment is going to be for you to write about this view. What I want you to do is basically present the view as stated here or as stated in any of the readings that you can find. Present the view and then present the argument that was given here against the view, right? So present the view, sort of say like what the view is and maybe why somebody would think it's a plausible sounding view. And then present the argument that goes against it, right? So if you pick the soul view, present the causal interaction argument. If you pick the psychological continuity view, then present the fission argument, etc. Present these views, present these arguments, and then pick a premise to deny, and then explain why you think that premise is wrong. So, probably what you want to do here is pick the kind of view that you like, that you think is true. And so that you can, you got to find a premise. You got to find a premise in each of these arguments, or not each of them, but in the argument that you pick. Find a premise in the argument that you pick that you think is wrong. Make sure it's a premise and not a conclusion. If it's got the word so or therefore in front of it, it's a conclusion, not a premise. So pick a premise to deny, right? So that's like, let's go back to this argument. If you think that you're a brain, and you're going to deny this argument, right? Because this argument concludes that I am not my brain. You have to pick premises 1 through 3, one of them. You have to say, this premise is false. And then you have to say why. Why do you think that that premise is false? Why do you think that this argument doesn't work to show that you're not your brain? And that's, but that's only if you're picking the brain view, right? If you're picking the brain view, if you're like, I like the brain view, then pick the brain view and present one of these, present this argument, and then talk about why you think one of the premises is false. All right. That explains it. Hopefully I'll make a slightly, maybe another little video explaining more about the paper when I post the prompt for it. And finally, yeah, like with the paper, be sure to be clear, be concise, and don't say anything false if you can help it. All right. There will be a quiz posted a little bit later this week, and then probably another short lecture to get us going into the next section of the course, which is going to be talking a little bit more about the philosophy of mind, which, perfect segue from the mind theory. And then we're going to talk a little bit about philosophy of language, which is something that I like to talk about. In particular, we're going to talk about beliefs, what it is to believe something, and a puzzle in the philosophy of language that has to do with what it is to believe something. All right. Have a great rest of your week.